This topic may be disturbing to some listeners. Viewer discretion advised.
All right, let's dive into a story that's both fascinating and kind of unsettling. The Cadaver Synod. You, a devout Catholic, have asked us to unpack this bizarre event from church history where a dead pope was put on trial.
It's a story that even centuries later makes you question how something so strange could happen within the church.
Exactly. We've got excerpts from church history texts, papal biographies, and even a law professor's analysis to help us understand how this trial came about, who the key players were, and what it means for our understanding of papal infallibility, especially when we consider pronouncements against so-called bad popes.
And what's really intriguing is how this story reveals the turbulent power dynamics of the time, where church and secular authority were constantly clashing.
Okay, so to understand why anyone would even think of putting a dead pope on trial, we need to go back to the 9th and 10th centuries, a period historians call the Iron Age of the papacy. It wasn't exactly a time of peace and harmony, right?
Definitely not. Imagine powerful Roman families constantly vying for controlled popes being deposed, assassinated, even rumored to have fathered children. It was like a real-life Game of Thrones, but with more incense and fewer dragons.
Wow, that's a far cry from the church we know today.
Yeah.
So in this chaotic environment, how does a figure like Pope Formosus rise to power? And what ultimately leads to this shocking trial after his death?
Formosus was a complex fire, ambitious, and perhaps even driven by a sense of justice. He started as a cardinal, but quickly found himself in the middle of these power struggles. He even fled Rome at one point, accused of wanting to become Archbishop of Bulgaria.
Right, he wanted to go to Bulgaria. That's interesting. What was that all about?
Well, back then, bishops weren't allowed to just switch dioceses. It was seen as a betrayal of their commitment and raised questions about their motives. Was Formosus after power, or was there a deeper concern for the church's well-being? This rule, though, forgotten today, really highlights how differently power and loyalty were viewed back then.
And Formosus breaking this rule, it feels like that's going to come back to bite him, doesn't it? But he does eventually become pope, despite these early controversies. So what happens during his papacy that sets the stage for the Cadaver Synod?
His papacy from 891 to 896 was filled with conflicts. He clashed with the Byzantine Patriarchate, the French throne, and even invited a foreign king, Arnulf of Carinthia, to invade Italy and challenge the reigning emperor.
Whoa, inviting a foreign power to invade. That's a risky move. Was he desperate, or was there a bigger strategy at play?
That's the question. Was he fearing for his safety, trying to protect the church's independence from the emperor? Or was it a power play? We need to remember that the Emperor Guy III of Spoleto was no friend to Formosus.
The Spoleto family.
Yeah.
Weren't they the ones who really pushed for the trial after Formosus died in 896?
Exactly. The Spoletos were always scheming for power. And Formosus's death, which some thought was suspicious given how quickly it happened, just gave them the opportunity they needed.
So then we get to the infamous Cadaver Synod in January 897. Pope Stephen VI, Formosus's successor, puts his decomposing body on trial. I mean, can you imagine the scene? A terrified deacon forced to defend a rotting corpse.
It's a gruesome image, and even more disturbing when you consider the legal aspect. This wasn't a trial in any real sense. It was a mockery of justice orchestrated by Stephen VI, likely under pressure from the Spoletos.
It's almost hard to believe this actually happened.
Yeah.
But before we get into the actual trial itself, let's talk about the charges against Formosus. Were they legitimate or just a way for his enemies to get back at him?
The sources mention perjury, coveting the papacy, and violating church canons during his election. But when you dig deeper, these charges start to seem pretty flimsy, likely motivated by political maneuvering rather than genuine concern.
Okay, so let's break it down. Perjury.
That charge was probably based on Formosus's oath to never return to Rome or act as a priest after he was excommunicated back in 876. But that whole excommunication was highly political, with accusations of conspiring against the papacy that, in hindsight, seem pretty dubious.
So it sounds like he was caught in the crosshairs of church politics, way before he even became pope.
Exactly. And then there's the charge of coveting the papacy. I mean, he was a prominent cardinal, so of course he'd be considered a candidate. That doesn't automatically make him power-hungry or willing to break church law.
Right, ambition is one thing, but violating church law is another. And speaking of that, what about the charge of violating church canons during his election? Was there something fishy about how he became pope?
It's possible. Given the chaotic state of the church back then, some procedural irregularities wouldn't be surprising. But the sources we have don't give us enough detail to say for sure whether these irregularities were significant enough to actually invalidate his election.
So it sounds like the charges against Formosus were, at best, questionable. This whole trial was less about justice and more about the Spoletos consolidating their power, right?
That's a reasonable conclusion to draw. The Cadaver Synod was about revenge and control, not about upholding church law or doctrine.
It's a chilling reminder that even the church founded on faith and morality can be manipulated for personal gain. But let's get back to the trial itself. This wasn't just a verbal condemnation, right?
Oh no. Formosus was found guilty, his corpse mutilated and then thrown into the Tiber River. It's a shocking act of desecration that speaks to the brutality of the time.
That's horrific. Did anyone challenge this verdict? I mean, this can't be how things were left right.
Thankfully, no. Later popes recognized the injustice and annulled the synod's verdict. The church, capable of self-correction, tried to right this terrible wrong.
That's reassuring. But this whole event, it makes you wonder, does it cast doubt on papal infallibility? If a pope can be condemned after death, what does it say about the authority of the papacy?
It's a profound question that has fueled theological debate for centuries. Some argue that the very act of later popes overturning the verdict actually reinforces papal infallibility. The church acknowledged a mistake and corrected it.
So essentially the system worked, even if it took a while.
That's one interpretation. However, others argue that the Cadaver Synod, regardless of its later annulment, raises serious questions about the limits of papal authority and the potential for abuse. It forces us to confront the fact that popes, like all human beings, are capable of making grave errors.
As a devout Catholic, this whole story is deeply unsettling. How are we supposed to reconcile this event with our faith? How do we think about bad popes and the idea that their decisions can be voided after their deaths?
That's a question each Catholic has to grapple with. It challenges our understanding of papal authority and infallibility. But perhaps the most important takeaway from the Cadaver Synod is that it serves as a stark reminder of the human element within the Church, capable of both great good and terrible acts.
It's incredible how one event, this Cadaver Synod, can spark such deep questions about faith power and the very nature of the Church.
Absolutely. It reminds us that history isn't just a collection of names and dates, but a living narrative that continues to challenge and shape us. And the story of Formosus and the Cadaver Synod raises a particularly interesting point about the relationship between the church and secular power.
You're right. Formosus inviting a foreign king to challenge the emperor. That was a bold, even dangerous move.
It was a decision born out of the turbulent political landscape of that era. The papacy was often caught in the middle of these power struggles between different factions.
It almost seems like Formosus was trying to assert the church's independence from secular control, even if it meant taking extreme measures.
That's a very plausible interpretation. He might have seen Arnulf as an ally, someone who could protect the church from the ambitions of the Spoleto family and other powerful Roman clans.
But in the end, it backfired, leading to his posthumous condemnation and all the chaos of the Cadaver Synod.
Indeed. The Cadaver Synod serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of getting too entangled in worldly politics. It's a reminder that the Church's true authority lies in its spiritual leadership, not in temporal power.
So what lessons can we as Catholics today draw from this story about the relationship between the Church and the world?
It's about finding a delicate balance. The Church can't isolate itself from the world, but it also can't compromise its core values and principles just for political gain.
It sounds like Formosus, despite his good intentions, might have strayed too far into those political waters.
That's a judgment for history to make. But his story offers us valuable insights into the complexities of navigating that intersection of faith and politics. It's a tension that the Church continues to grapple with today.
This whole deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's given me a whole new understanding of papal history and the challenges faced by those who lead the Church.
And it's pushed us to examine these fundamental questions about authority, justice, and our own individual search for truth within our faith.
The Cadaver Synod might be a distant historical event, but its echoes can still be felt today.
It reminds us that the past is never truly gone, and the lessons we learn from history can help us navigate our own complex times.
We hope this deep dive has encouraged you to think critically about this period of church history. The Cadaver Synod is a powerful reminder of the human flaws that can exist even within the Church, but also of the Church's capacity for self-correction and growth.
It's a story that prompts us to reflect on the nature of leadership, the balance of power, and the search for truth and justice that should guide us all, both as individuals and as members of the Church.
So if this story made you question everything you thought you knew, wait until you hear about the time a pope had to flee Rome disguised as a woman. but that's a deep dive for another time.